In the latest newsletter from Mark Gurman, he alluded that the 16-inch MacBook Pro might not get refreshed until November, which absolutely makes me frustrated. You know, a lot of us were expecting to get new M1X Macs in June, then we were expecting, maybe September, now it's maybe October, now it's maybe November, and I'm asking myself whether or not we're gonna get a repeat of last year, where Apple decided to have 3 events in a row, but the question we're really asking ourselves is Apple going to have a fluffy event, where there's not too much to announce, but they throw one in there just for the sake of let's get people's attention and get people watching because they think something might get announced that's exciting when in reality, not really. Let's begin. So there's still a lot of things to get excited for, it's just that those exciting 90 days I talked about might be starting, at the end of this month instead of the beginning. But the good news is Gurman is saying that the iPhone 13 is still on track to launch next month, so that doesn't sound like it's been delayed. Wedbush had been saying they were going to launch in the 3rd week of September, so if that ends up being correct, I would not be surprised if the actual keynote date is on September 14th, and then that means we will pre-order that Friday, and then deliveries will be a week from then if all things go according to the usual Apple schedule. But if the M1X Macs have been delayed because of mass production or chip shortage or mini LED complications, whatever the reason may be, does it actually make sense for Apple to have an October event dedicated to what exactly? Well, as small and incremental as it may sound, I think that there's actually enough announcements to fill not a really exciting an event, but an event from Apple nonetheless in October just dedicated to iPads, and perhaps even updating a few services. But by far the most exciting iPad of the year, in my opinion, is the iPad Mini 6. I've gotten really pumped at the idea of taking, the iPad Air and making it cheaper and more affordable and more compact. I think that iPad could end up being really popular, knowing that it has Type-C, it's all in on gesture control, and you'd have Touch ID in the power button. Apple has seen tremendous success with the iPad Air, and the iPad Mini has always been cool, but the hardware is always getting hand-me-downs. It's never getting the latest and greatest, and this is the first time the iPad Mini display will actually change. The form factor will change, the footprint will change. For the most part, iPad Mini has been unchanged since they announced it, so I think similar to how the iPad Air and budget iPad 8 took up a lot of time at the September event last year, I could imagine a fairly short October event, easily one that does not even reach the 1-hour mark, that's just about the iPad Mini 6, and another iPad that I forgot to even mention in the next Apple's exciting 90 days. But there's genuinely been some interesting developments with the iPad 9. So the next generation budget iPad, which is rumored to of course still retain its $330 starting price, but likely borrowing the same hardware of the iPad Air 3. So a thinner overall chassis, a larger 10.5-inch display. It would still be working with the budget iPad's keyboard accessories, and it would still have Lightning, so this would still of course work with the first generation Apple Pencil. But now, for the first time ever, you may be able to get a budget iPad with a laminated display, which is by far always been my biggest issue with that iPad. For people that aren't used to looking at laminated displays, it's probably not that big a deal, but once you see it, and once you get comfortable with it, it becomes very noticeable when you go back to non-laminated, so it makes sense for them to keep the budget iPad non-laminated, especially back when they were selling the iPad Air 3. It was very similar to that of the budget iPad, so now that the rest of the iPad lineup is moving on towards USB-C and having a more futuristic squared-off design and no home button, I can understand why Apple might feel comfortable now to update the budget iPad to give it a bit more performance, give it a better display, give it a bigger display, because now the rest of the iPad lineup is just going to look way cooler. So essentially reusing the iPad Air 3 hardware to make a $300 iPad could be really compelling to a lot of iPad users out there, and while the technical hardware aspect of it is not super exciting for us geeks out there, this is, at the end of the day, the best-selling iPad. We get excited for iPad Airs and iPad Pro announcements and M1 chips and mini LED, but most people don't care about all that crap. They're all buying the budget iPad, so if there's a cheaper iPad around the corner, this is something that you might want to be aware of, because if you're thinking of getting a low-cost budget iPad, you might be better off waiting a couple of months, given Apple has always released a budget iPad every year since 2017, I don't expect 2021 to be any exception. This is the best-selling iPad, so of course they want to refresh it. And while I agree there probably wouldn't be too much for them to say on stage, at the same time, at the September event last year, they talked about the iPad 8 a lot, and there were basically no changes at all. Same exact design, just with an A12 chip. So this time, I could see them giving it an A13 chip or a 14 chip, and also talking about the display being laminated now, talking about the larger display. It would not be a very jam-packed event. I'll definitely agree that having just an iPad event in October that's dedicated to, okay, we've redesigned the iPad mini and we pretend like the iPad Air doesn't exist. Just like the September event last year, they were like, we have drastically redesigned the iPad Air. Yeah, but that was because the Air 3 was just a toned-down Pro. So they weren't really comparing it to the 11-inch iPad Pro. They were just acting like, ooh, so many colors, this is such a great redesign. And Apple's just magical at making old products look new. They're very good at that. So I could imagine them doing the same thing with the iPad mini 6, talking about how this is the biggest change to the iPad mini ever. We've come up with this great new redesign that's drastically different. It's not just an iPad Air, but smaller. No, it's totally unique, and you've never seen a compact tablet like this before. And they'll be able to brag about how it's like the fastest performance ever in a tablet of this cost. Like, you can't match it with any other tablet that's $499. Probably getting the same A15 chip that the iPhones are getting. So maybe there's a whole keynote worth of iPad announcements that cap out at around 40-45 minutes. If you don't think that's long enough for an Apple keynote, they did one last November. It did not even take an hour. So I would not be shocked if they ended up doing this, and then in November, just on the anniversary of the M1 chip, that's when we get the M1X chip. Apple had to wait a full 12 months before they gave us anything better than the M1, but chip shortages, I get it. But that's when we get a whole dedicated keynote to the redesigned MacBook Pros, which I'm sure there's lots to talk about with those new ports, mini LED, and of course all of the great performance enhancements of the M1X chip. Hopefully a Mac Mini as well. Personally, as I think it's possible for Apple to have more fluff in their events and to actually have 3 by the end of this year, it's not really what I would prefer. I would much rather have a more packed event just in October where they talk about all the new iPads and they talk about all the Macs on one keynote, because that's more exciting to me. But some people just really love Apple's cinematography in their presentation, so they just want to see how many Apple can possibly come up with, no matter how small and tiny the announcements are. So I'm curious how you guys feel about it. Would you like 3 events, or would you rather have 2, rather packed, rather full events where in September we get iPhones, Apple Watches, and AirPods, in October we get iPads and Macs, or are you okay if Apple kind of sprinkles it out throughout the year? Feel free to let me know. This is your Apple Sheep here. We'll see you guys in the next one.